Welcome to another CO2 Coffee with ICOS. We are producing these little videos every Friday, and we want to overcome these times of confinement where we can't meet in person with this virtual cafe. And we have teamed up with Fridays for Future to discuss things that are going around climate change, about greenhouse gases, the impact of climate change. And we have also always invited a scientist to join us and support us in this discussion. Today, I want to welcome a scientist and a Friday for Future activist from Germany. The Fridays for Future activist is Svenja Kant. Welcome, Svenja. And the scientist is Dr. Benjamin Rabe from the Alfred-Wegener Institute for Polar Research in Bremerhaven. Welcome, Benjamin.
Morning.
And we have invited Benjamin because Svenja has selected the Arctic as the topic for today. So, Svenja, why did you select this topic?
Well, I've chosen it because I think that many people have this notion that whatever happens in the Arctic stays there. But from my experience, people don't know much about it. And even though it is really important and also very interesting, I think.
But before going into the details of these scientific questions, I would like to introduce you a little bit more. So, Svenja, you are 17 years old, right?
Yeah.
And just finalizing school, so you're in your final exams?
Next week.
Okay, good luck for this. And you are active at Fridays for Future since?
Since a little bit over a year, I think.
And how did you come to Fridays for Future? What did motivate you?
Well, I went on a school strike with my friends on Friday, of course. And after that, I just started to become involved in all these online working groups that we have. And it just went from there, I think. So I'm a speaker of the German working group Forderungen, so in English demands, which published our demands to the German government and since then makes, for example, graphics informing about climate change on our social media channel.
And you can do both your school exam and Fridays for Future. That's very impressive.
Well, it is a bit time consuming, but I think it's worth it.
Final question is, how are you coping with this online strike?
Well, it is definitely different. So we have an online strike, which is also international, but it is a whole other thing to be out there on the streets because you feel that you are making an impact. And it's not so much the case with online striking, but we all have to adapt to the circumstances, I guess.
And I have one more question. What's your perspective after finalizing school?
Coronavirus mixed in with my plans, but I will probably study and maybe something to become a scientist later.
Okay. Perhaps you want to become a polar scientist and you are interested in going on a research vessel to the Arctic, then you definitely can discuss with Benjamin about that. Benjamin, what made you a scientist?
Well, I was interested at school already in math and physics, and I decided in the end that I wanted something applied, and physical oceanography was the thing I studied. And via various pathways, I came to the Arctic, and I've been working there for quite a few years now at the Alfred-Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven. And my main task is to do observations in the Arctic Ocean.
So you have been on the Mosaic Expedition in the last month.
So Mosaic is a year-round experiment where Polarstern has been drifting through the Arctic ice, so the central Arctic, mainly the Eurasian side of the Arctic. And the main focus has been, or is still, to study upper ocean ice, snow, and atmosphere processes. So we're mostly interested in what happens close to the interface between these, and of course above and below. Those processes are very important to improve future model projections, for example, of climate, but also numerical forecasting on shorter timescales.
And among many other instruments, the Polarstern also has an ICOS instrument for measuring the fluxes between the ocean and the atmosphere. So we are, of course, very interested in the results there as well. So we are coming to our question part. Svenja, what's your first question?
My question was, why is the Arctic region so important?
So the Arctic is a region that has not been studied very much because it's very hard to access. Still, people have tried, even over 100 years ago, Nansen did. And we still keep going there and trying to understand this very complex system of atmosphere, ice, and ocean, which is unique to the polar regions, of course. In addition, in the Arctic, you have a lot of river input, which makes the near-surface waters fairly fresh. So that gives it really a unique combination on Earth. The Arctic can have an influence even on our latitudes. So, for example, the freshwater export change from the Arctic could influence the circulation further south. Things like our global conveyor belt of warm water that is being fed towards Europe and then is integrated into colder water below, that sort of circulation could change. There are other things like cold air outbreaks that can reach us from the Arctic within a few days through the atmosphere. So the Arctic in general is a very important place. There are other regional effects that are, of course, of global relevance, such as if sea ice disappears, shipping will change, shipping routes will open. So that would also influence the social and economic part of our society.
I made at some point as a land scientist, the Arctic is also very important because we have a lot of carbon storage there in the soils, in the so-called permafrost soils. And if one tipping point is reached that these permafrost soils thaw and are transferred into CO2, then we might have a big problem.
Well, so I've heard that the Arctic is warming up faster than the rest of the world. Why is that, and how do changes there affect Europe?
So I already mentioned the uniqueness, that's the sea ice. That's one of the unique points. And when you have sea ice, it's generally reflecting sunlight fairly well, at least when there is good snow cover and not many melt ponds, these are these melted out bits in the sea ice. So most of the sunlight is then reflected and therefore it's not absorbed. So the energy doesn't stay there, therefore it's not heating up as much. If you remove some of the sea ice, you will get a much darker surface, which can absorb a lot more of the sunlight than it would normally reflect with the sea ice. And hence, you warm up the water more, and therefore you will probably form less sea ice or melt more sea ice, which in turn leads to less sea ice in the future, and so on. So this is kind of a feedback loop, and it's called the ice albedo feedback. That's one of the reasons why the Arctic has a much faster warming than the rest of the world. It's about twice as fast the warming as the global average. And there are other things that feed into that, for example, thunderstorms at lower latitudes that get warm air from near the surface into the upper parts of the atmosphere, which can then reach the polar regions more easily. So there are quite a few aspects to that, but the ice albedo is probably the simplest way to think about this, what's called Arctic amplification.
Well, thank you. So how does this affect us here in Europe?
So, for example, Arctic sea ice cover reduction could cause more extreme weather in the northern hemisphere and mid-latitudes, and it could include droughts and floods. Some studies suggest that the jet stream may get wavier and weaker. That's a band of currents of air that kind of circle the Arctic region. There are lots of things that are still subject to ongoing research. So the cold air breaks I mentioned before, they are probably part of that.
Perhaps again on the land side or on the coastal side this time, of course, the warming up of the Arctic may also lead to deglaciation of Greenland, which comes with a sea level rise. And then, of course, you can imagine that many of the coastal cities in Europe will be in problems. Well, there might be also economic changes. We discussed this, or we touched this already in the beginning, that an ice-free Arctic can change the shipping routes, but it can also increase the, let's say, hunting for raw materials, and this might be even a negative effect on all our efforts to reduce fossil fuels, because if more fossil fuels become available, it might be that they also will be used. So there's a lot of political things also to discuss within Europe or also globally. Did this answer your question, Svenja?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Well, Benjamin, I heard that you personally participated in the Mosaic Expedition. What did you witness there?
So we actually witnessed a lot less sea ice north of the Laptev Sea, that's in northern Russia, than we would have expected or that we had in many other years. That's why the expedition actually started only around 85 north, because we had to find a sufficiently strong ice flow and various other flows around to deploy our instruments and have Polarstern dock on the ice. The main idea of Mosaic is to join forces between these different nations that have scientific resources and expertise and instruments, and really try to get the best out of this joint effort. And I think that's what we're doing right at the moment. And I'm pretty sure the results of this will be felt for quite a few years afterwards. So the Polarstern actually docked onto the central flow, which we call it. This is the main ice flow where we have the Polarstern and various installations around. And within about 1 or 2 kilometers, we put further instruments that had to be maintained. And then in a region sort of 40 to 50 kilometers around, we put further autonomous instruments that could measure and transmit their data by satellite. And that's a truly interdisciplinary effort as well. So we're not concentrating only on the physics of the ice, atmosphere, and ocean, but we also concentrate on the biogeochemistry and also on the ecosystem.
Now, this is quite interesting for me because I'm a biologist by education, and it would be very interesting to learn a little bit more about what's the biological consequences of the changes in the ice pattern.
So if the ice changes, the water column, the structure of the water column may change due to different freeze and thaw cycles, and therefore you may influence the availability of nutrients, for example, to very small animals or plants actually living in the upper part of the water column. That's one effect that can be felt. The other thing is that quite a lot of animals and also plants, so we call it phytoplankton in the Arctic, and algae, they actually live on the underside of the ice. So if you remove the ice, obviously they cannot be there anymore. And it can affect animals up all the way through the food chain. So of course, if you change the primary production of biology, if you like, you will eventually affect the end of the food chain. And the change in the ice cover, of course, also will affect animals like polar bears or seals or Arctic foxes and so on.
But the polar bear is not the only living being there. There is a whole ecosystem. That's what I've learned from you. And although the polar bear is the symbol, you are looking at the whole ecosystem and all the other plants and animals. And so we are coming to some kind of a conclusion, and what I've learned is that the things in the Arctic are changing very fast, and that we have somehow to act very quickly. So the Arctic is warming much faster than other regions. The Arctic is very vulnerable, and this means that actions for mitigating climate change, which is in fact the reduction of emissions, should be accelerated even, and that's, I think, is an important message to you, Svenja, to the Fridays for Future. How are you taking this kind of information from scientists that we have to act very quickly? How are you taking this up into your daily work?
Well, so what Benjamin just mentioned, that scientists do work together and join their forces and their efforts. I think that we as FFF stand for that politicians do the same, and that they work together, and especially that they collaborate together across borders to save not only the Arctic, but also, ultimately people in the global south, as well as future generations, from these very real dangers that will probably intensify as we continue to emit greenhouse gas as much as we do now.
I would like to connect this to the recent IPCC report that has also given some kind of projections, and there are these somehow famous emission scenarios, and the worst case scenario, which is the so-called 8.5 scenario, is even predicting that the Arctic may become completely ice-free in summers. So Benjamin, if we reduce quicker and really have efforts to mitigate climate change, is there some hope for the sea ice?
So, I mean, when you look at this graph, you can see the lines in different colors, which represent the different scenarios. And then you see a large spread, of course, around it, which means this includes the variability between different models and also the natural variability that will always occur in our system. Still, the middle line is the thing we need to take as the general mean over a slightly longer time around each of these years that are displayed here. And what you can see is that the worst case scenario actually does what you said. It gives it a real possibility that our Arctic will be quasi ice free, so meaning only 1 million square kilometers out of a current about 8 would be covered by sea ice in summer. Even if we reduce our emissions significantly, the model still predicts a decline of about a half by the later part of this century. So we probably won't be able to stop it completely, but we should do something to slow it down. So yes, I think according to what these climate models say and what the IPCC report will publish, it would help to reduce the emissions.
Okay, if we could refer to a campaign that's today running in Germany by Fridays for Future, which is about the subsidies for fossil fuel emitting cars or fossil fuel using cars, and then we could perhaps summarize in a tweet saying something like, "Dear Ms. Merkel, if the polar bears had the same saying in the German policy as the shareholders of the car companies, subsidies for fossil fuel cars should not come." Would you agree on that, Svenja?
Yeah, definitely. So we're basically demanding from the politicians and from the government that they make a deal that strengthens those economies and that makes, well, our future safe as well, and not only the imminent next months.
So thank you again. We have, as always, the possibility to discuss this video Fridays at 14 Central European Summer Time, and later also in the YouTube commenting space. And if you want to know more about ICOS work in the Arctic, you can go to the same YouTube channel and look for the station descriptions. We have 3 little movies of Arctic stations in northern Finland, in Svalbard, and in Greenland there. And there you can, of course, learn a little bit more about what ICOS is doing. And you can look at the ads on the under the video here in YouTube, where you can get a lot of links for additional information. Again, thank you very much. Thank you to our participants, and see you next Friday.